Now, when we talk of activity-based costing, it's normally called an alternative costing techniques. We have what is known as traditional costing techniques, and we have alternative costing techniques to the traditional costing techniques. When we talk of traditional costing techniques, in this case, we have absorption costing and maybe marginal costing. Now, what are some of the alternative costing techniques to the absorption costing and marginal costing? We have number one, what is known as activity-based costing. Number two, we have what is known as target costing. Number three, we have what is known as throughput accounting. Number four, we have what is called product life cycle costing. Number five, we have environmental accounting. So we have different alternative costing techniques. But for our focus for this session is on a technique that is known as activity-based costing. So our focus for the session today is on activity-based costing. Now, you must note that absorption costing is normally a traditional costing technique. Activity-based costing, on the other hand, is an alternative costing technique. And for it to be an alternative, it must be an alternative to something. What is it an alternative to? It's an alternative method to absorption costing. It's an alternative method to absorption costing. So when we talk of activity-based costing, it's an alternative method to absorption costing. So in this chapter or in this session, we'll be comparing activity-based costing to absorption costing, or ABC versus AC. So when I'm referring to ABC, moving forward, I'm referring to activity-based costing. When I refer to AC, I'm referring to absorption costing. So whenever you hear me talking of ABC, that is activity-based costing. Whenever you hear me talking of AC, that is absorption costing. So these are the alternative terms that we can use. Okay? Now, AC and ABC can be used, this is an important point, can be used to calculate the cost per unit of a product or a service. So when you want to calculate the cost per unit of a product or a service, you can either use AC or ABC as alternative methods of calculating the cost per unit. Now, let's go back to chapter 2, which is known as cost classification. In chapter 2, we looked at different ways of classifying costs. Number one, we classify costs by their elements. We said when we look at elements of costs, we have material, labor, and expenses. Number two, we looked at classification of costs by their nature. When we classified costs by their nature, we had direct costs and indirect costs. In chapter 2, we say direct costs are costs traceable to a specific cost unit. We say direct costs are also known as prime costs. On the other hand, indirect costs, we define them as costs not traceable to a specific cost unit. And we say these indirect costs are also known as overheads. Now, in this chapter, we will therefore be classifying costs by their nature. When costs are classified by their nature, they can either be direct or indirect. Direct are also known as prime costs, and indirect are also known as overheads, or indirect are also known as overheads. So note that in activity-based costing, we are classifying costs by their nature. So that is what we have in this slide. So when costs are classified by their nature, we have direct costs and indirect costs. Now, when we classify costs by their nature, in other words, we will be taking direct costs plus indirect costs. Therefore, cost per unit will be direct cost per unit plus indirect cost per unit because we are classifying costs by their nature. Now, we say direct costs is also known as prime costs. So when we talk of direct cost per unit, we can also refer to it as prime cost per unit. When we refer to indirect costs per unit, we can also look at them as overhead costs per unit. Now, how do we get these prime costs? Prime cost combines direct material costs plus direct labor costs plus direct expenses. When you have a combination of materials plus labor plus expenses, so long as they are direct, it gives you what is known as prime costs. So when you take prime costs plus overheads, that is what gives you the cost per unit. I hope that introduction is hard or well understood. Now take note that the accounting treatment, let me take you back. Remember, we have direct costs per unit and indirect cost per unit. The accounting treatment of these direct costs per unit is the same under AC and ABC. I'm repeating. When you are in AC and ABC, you need to calculate the cost per unit. Now, when you are calculating cost per unit, you get the same answer regardless of which method you use when you are calculating direct costs. So direct costs, which are also known as prime costs, their accounting treatment is the same, whether you use ABC or you use AC. The difference between ABC and AC is on how you account for indirect costs. How you account for indirect costs is what brings the difference between AC and ABC. There is no difference when accounting for direct costs. The only difference between AC and ABC is how you account for indirect costs. I hope that point is clear. Now we can go and read this. The accounting treatment of direct costs, which are also known as prime costs, is the same under both AC and ABC. What do you mean by that? You will get the same result. The difference between AC and ABC is on how you account for indirect costs, which are also known as overheads. I hope that point is clear. So what does that point tell us? How you account for direct costs is the same under both AC and ABC. But how you account for indirect costs is different between AC and ABC. So always note, if you've been asked differences between AC and ABC is on how you account for overheads. Overheads are also known as indirect costs. Overheads are also known as indirect costs. Okay. Now, let's elaborate on this difference. Let's expound on this difference between AC and ABC. So we are saying that under AC, overheads are apportioned using labor hours. Let me take you back. We said the difference between AC and ABC is on how you account for indirect costs. Indirect costs are also known as overheads. Now, how do we account for these indirect costs? Under AC, overheads are allocated or apportioned, rather, not allocated, apportioned using labor hours or sometimes machine hours, the higher of the two. I'm repeating. How do we share out overhead costs? Under AC, we share out overhead costs using either labor hours or machine hours. Under ABC, we allocate using what we call cost pools and cost drivers. I know you may ask, what are those? We will look at them. So that is what we have in this slide. Under AC, overheads are apportioned either using labor hours or machine hours. So for example, if you have 10,000 labor hours and you have 8,000 machine hours, you choose the higher of the two. So if labor hours are more than machine hours, you use labor hours. If machine hours are more than labor hours, you use machine hours. However, if you have been told to use labor hours, use labor hours, even if it is small. If you have been told to use machine hours, use what you have been told. If you have not been told, what to use is when you choose the higher of the two. But if you have been told how to share the overhead costs, use what you have been told. Point number 2, ABC overheads are apportioned using cost pools and cost drivers. So when you are apportioning overheads under ABC, you look for what is called cost pool and you look for cost driver. Now, what is a cost pool? A cost pool is an activity that consumes resources. A cost pool is an activity that consumes resources. For example, you may have overhead costs of 10 million in your company. If your overhead costs in your company are 10 million, these activities that sum up to 10 million is what we call cost pools. For example, out of the 10 million, there can be a cost pool known as rent. There can be a cost pool known as machine setup costs. There can be a cost pool known as procurement costs. There can be a cost pool known as material handling costs. These activities that consumes resources are what are known as cost pools. Now, on the other hand, cost driver is the basis of apportionment of cost pool. Basis of apportionment of cost pool, in other words, is a unit of activity that consumes resources. For example, if cost pool is rent, the best way to share rent is depending on area. So we can say that area is the cost driver of rent. Rent being the cost pool, area being the cost driver. Let's look at examples. So I have here cost pools as a column and also cost drivers as another column. So if we start with examples of cost pools, for example, if we have machine setup costs, the best way to share machine setup costs depends on number of setups. So if one department has got more setups, it will have more setup costs. If another department has got few setups, it will have fewer setup costs. Another cost pool can be purchasing costs. How can we share purchasing costs? Depending on number of purchase orders. Number of purchase orders. Maybe another cost pool can be quality control costs. How best can we share quality control costs? Depending on number of inspections. Depending on number of inspections. We also have rent. Rent can be shared depending on area. I believe I've already explained that. Order handling costs can be depending on the number of orders. It can depend on number of orders. So in exams, you must identify the most appropriate cost driver for each cost pool given. You must identify the most appropriate cost driver for each cost pool that you have been provided with. Now, how do we account for ABC? When you want to account for ABC, there are a number of steps you can follow. Steps that you can follow when you want to account for activity-based costing. So there are 6 steps you need to familiarize yourself with when accounting for activity-based costing. Step number 1, you need to identify the cost pools in the overhead costs provided. So what are cost pools? For example, if your overhead costs were 10 million, you need to identify what are the components of 10 million. What are the activities in the 10 million? So you can identify that out of the 10 million, there is maybe rent, there is setup costs, there is material handling costs. That becomes your step 1. Identify the cost pool. So your cost pools are rent, setup costs, and material handling costs. Step number 2, allocate total overhead costs to each cost pool. For example, if your overhead costs are 10 million, you need to identify out of 10 million, what is the percentage that is taken by rent? Maybe we assume rent accounts for 25% of the overhead costs. What is the percentage taken by setup costs? Maybe we assume setup cost takes 20%. What is the percentage taken by material handling costs? We assume that maybe it's 30%. This process of trying to know the percentage taken by each cost pool is step number 2. It is known as allocate total overhead costs to each cost pool. Step number 3, determine the cost driver for each cost pool. Now, for example, for rent, you need to determine what is the cost driver of rent. You can say it is area. If it is machine setup costs, you can say the cost driver is number of setups. So that is step number 3. Determine the cost driver for each cost pool. You realize this topic is related to overheads because we are accounting for overheads in activity-based costing. We are accounting for indirect costs. That's why in overheads, there was also basis of apportionment. Now, once you have determined or identified the cost driver for each cost pool, you collect data about each cost driver. How do you collect data about each cost driver? In this case, in about each, you find out what is the space, what is the area occupied by each department if you are looking at rent. If you are looking at setup costs, what are the number of setups in maybe each department? That is to collect data about each cost driver. That means how many setups do we have in each department? Step number 5, calculate the total overhead cost for each department. Calculate the total overhead costs for each department. And finally, calculate the overhead cost per unit for each department. Calculate the overhead cost per unit for each department. Calculate the overhead cost per unit for each department. So that is the steps in accounting for overheads. How do we account for overheads? Those are the steps that we follow when you want to account for overheads. Now, we have a number of examples, maybe one example, and then the others I'll give you as an assignment. So we have examples that we'll be looking at. I've picked one example from your notes, and then I've also given you some 2 other examples that we'll be looking at in activity-based costing. So let's read this example, and then we'll go and solve it in Excel. So the question reads, X Limited makes 2 types of high-quality products. X Limited makes 2 types of high-quality products. One product is called the light, and the other product is called the heavy, L and H. Details of the 2 products are as follows, product L and product H. Remember, what is our objective? Our objective is to calculate cost per unit. Our objective is to find the cost per unit using either AC or ABC. The objective is to find cost per unit. So budgeted production volume is 10,000 and 5,000. Direct material cost per unit, 8 and 16. Direct labor hours, note these hours, not cost. Direct labor hours per unit is given. Machine hours per unit is given. Additional information. Direct labor costs $8 per hour, and labor hours for the period are budgeted at 20,000. Machine hours for the period are budgeted at 25,000. Production overheads are estimated as 260,000. An analysis of the production overhead establishes that these costs arises in relation to 4 activities in the following proportions and has the following associated volumes. So you have been given the associated volumes, the cost pool, the proportions, and the activities. and the basis of apportionment is also given. Required, calculate the cost per unit for each product using traditional method. We say traditional method is the absorption costing. And then number 2, calculate the cost per unit using activity-based costing. Calculate the cost per unit using activity-based costing. So that is what we have in our first session of activity-based costing. Now, when we come back for the other session, for the next session, we will solve this example. We will solve this example.